Alright, so hello Rebel Scum, once again. Uh, Today I'm going to talk to you about codexes. I mentioned in my last video about canon that I would go ahead and move into this topic, and I would like to start off with a reading from a internet meme. When I talk about bad theology that's out there in the world today, one of the things that I really point to is that we have narratives. Everybody out there has a narrative of something that they believe, and we oftentimes will stick to a narrative even if it isn't true. And these memes that are out there, sometimes opinions that are given by famous people, celebrities, rather than go out and research, we will oftentimes stick to a narrative. So let me read this one to you. And this is a pretty large one, but you may have seen it or some form of it on the internet. So here it goes. It says, the King James Version of the New Testament was completed in 1611 by 8 members of the Church of England. There were not, and still are not, any original texts to translate. The 2 oldest manuscripts available were penned hundreds of years after the last apostle allegedly died. They contain 3,036 conflicting textual variations and do not mention a resurrection in the earliest written gospel. That part was secretly added to copies generations later. There were over 8,000 copies of the copies made, producing a story so blindingly contradictory that Christians count 133 contrary opinions of different authorities concerning the year the Messiah appeared on earth, from the Encyclopedia Britannica. But that doesn't matter. King James translators didn't refer to any of these manuscripts anyway. Instead, they edited previous translations of the corrupted documents to create an entirely new Bible which the king and Parliament would approve of. In other words, 21st century Christians believe the Word of God is a book edited in the 17th century from tainted 16th century translations of 8,000 contradictory copies of contaminated 4th century scrolls that can't claim to be copies of secretly falsified lost letters that possibly first written at the earliest in the last years of the 1st century regarding a Gnostic character who lived 2 or perhaps 3 generations earlier, but no historian, social commentator, court record keeper, curious onlooker, or graffiti artist along the entire eastern Mediterranean seaboard apparently noticed during his supposed life. Is this what Christians mean by faith? And it's supposedly a comment made by John Zand from the Superstitious Naked Ape. Now, I hate to say this, but this is bad theology. This is not true. This is pretty much a series of various lies and arguments that more than likely are based on a certain author, which I'll mention in a moment. What we're talking about here. Let's go ahead and let's start off. They say that the King James was completed by a group of 8 members of a council, and that is a lie. It was actually 47 scholars, all of who were members of the Church of England. And you can read about this in the Bible in English, Its History and Influence from Yale University. I'm going to go even a step further, and I'm going to list the translators by name, so you know I'm not making this up. We have various groups of translators. It wasn't just one translator, it was groups of them. So you have the First Westminster Company, which was Lancelot Andrews, John Overall, Hadrian Saravina, Richard Clark, John Layfield, Robert Tye, Francis Berlin, Geoffrey King, Richard Thompson, William Bedell. You have the First Cambridge Company, which was Edward Lively, John Richardson, Lawrence Chaterson, Francis Dillingham, Roger Andrews, Thomas Harrison, Robert Spalding, and Andrew Byng. You have the First Oxford Company, which was John Harding, John Reynolds, Thomas Holland, Richard Kilby, Miles Smith, Richard Brett, Daniel Fairclough, William Thorne. You have the second Oxford Company, which was Thomas Ravish, George Abbott, Richard Eates, Giles Thompson, Sir Henry Saville, John Perrin, Ralph Ravens, John Harmon, John Aglaby, Leonard Hutton. You have the second Westminster Company, which was William Barlow, John Spencer, Roger Fenton, Ralph Hutchison, William Dawkins, Michael Rabbit, Thomas Sanderson, who was the Archdeacon of Rochester. You have the second Cambridge Company, which was John DePort, William Branthwaite, Jeremiah Radcliffe, Samuel Ward, Andrew Downes, John Boyce, Robert Ward, Thomas Bilson, and Richard Bancroft. And these are the translators, and that doesn't cover everybody who was involved. You also have, according to Dr. Dennis Hensley and Dr. James Humes, that there were several others that basically consulted with the grammar. Both these doctors believe that William Shakespeare, at the age of 46, helped with the grammar of the Psalms. Now, a lot of people will say, well, William Shakespeare didn't help with the New Testament and he didn't help with the translation. That is true. But being that the Bible translation, the King James translation, did contain elements of the Bishop's Bible, which was a Bible meant to be read aloud and contained very flowery speech, high English, it was believed that they, with the Psalms especially, which is a book of song and poetry, that they approached William Shakespeare to help them with the translation of it so that the thought-for-thought concept of that book would be upheld. Now, he also makes arguments in this thing about manuscripts that they're, hundreds of years after apostles. And that is relatively true. Now, by manuscripts, I'm thinking he means codexes. And codexes, again, I've mentioned it before, are separate from canon. There's canon, which was the list of books. Codexes are the gathering of books. Now, these are translations of earlier texts. Basically, they are, here were some texts, some letters, and to collate the Bible, they brought them all together into a codex. The guy basically said, okay, this one here, translated it, got the next letter, this one here, translated it, this one here, translated it. And we have really ancient knowledge and books that we must be able to realize. We have over 200,000 texts from the New Testament that are out there. These are letters, substantiated letters of the New Testament that basically back up a lot of these claims. The oldest book that we have on record is actually the book of John, and we have it within a century of when it was written. And that was, I think it was 70 years, within 70 years of when it was written. Now that sounds like a lot to anyone who has never studied history, and maybe I'll address that in a moment, but let's keep to this meme really quick. He mentions that there were conflicting ideas of when the Messiah was born, and that also is true as far as the year goes, because it mentions in the Bible, it mentions a certain feast. We can pinpoint more than likely within a day or two of what day he was born within the year. But as far as the year goes, there is some argument to that. But we have actually, a lot of scholars continue to study this, and they believe they have pinpointed it within a few years. The Encyclopedia Britannica that they are quoting from is the 1911 version, which is an interesting number because that would be 300 years after the King James was written that they are making this claim, and that means that this author who created this meme is using a encyclopedia from 100 years ago to make theirs. So, interesting thought. But when it comes to all these arguments in here, certain things become very visible, certain things become very known, and that is that when it comes to fallibility critiques of the New Testament, especially the King James, one figure kind of steps forward and in this, if you've ever read any of his work, a lot of this, especially the translation of translation of translation, which is something he loves to state, is Bart Ehrman, who is a UNC professor. And most of these claims have been refuted already. I mean, I just refuted one of them in this video. It's not a hard thing to do, talking about 8 translators. We know that's false. We have records of it. But anyway, Bart Ehrman has been refuted by various people such as Dr. Timothy Jones, who's the VP of SBT. You have the Dr. William Craig, who's a PhD from the University of Birmingham and Doctor of Theology from the University of Munich. You have Dr. Michael Licona, who's a PhD at the University of Pretoria. You have Dr. Daniel Wallace, and the list goes on and on and on. And why do people continue with these memes? It's because people continue to fall for the old adage, hey, if it's been printed and sounds official, it must be true. It's not just the internet that does this to us. It's not just the internet that you go to it and you're going to find people who make a wild claim, and because it's on the internet, some people say, oh, it has to be true. Same thing still happens with books, especially history books. And you know it's true. You know that there are people out there who will find anything and believe it. There are people who believed, what was the one book a few years ago? The Da Vinci Code. There are people who believe that the Da Vinci Code was a real book. I mean, no joke. Some people will fall for anything. And so people essentially choose a narrative. There are people who are, anti-Bible, anti-Christianity, and they say, oh, well, this guy knows what he's talking about because his narrative upholds my own, and that is that Christianity is false. But isn't this what we Christians are accused of? Aren't we pretty much accused of believing a book and putting faith in that book that it is absolutely true?